So I'm delighted to welcome back to Belfast very exciting young scholar, Luca Bertolani Azeredo. Luca is PhD candidate, nearly finished.
Submitted.
Yes, in global history and governance at the Scuola Superiore Meridionale in Naples, working on political violence and paramilitary bodies in Ireland before the First World War. He holds a master's from the University of Padua and has been a visiting scholar here in Queen's and also at UCC in Cork, and has published a number of book chapters on Irish and Italian history. So Luca's work is focusing very much on the origins of paramilitarism before the First World War. That's what he's going to talk to us about today, specifically the Enniskillen Horse, illegality, legitimacy, and the birth of Irish paramilitarism. Luca, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much, Peter, and good evening, everybody, to those here in this room and also to those online. I mean, I've been participating into these seminars for, since 3 years ago, for my first time here as a visiting student in Belfast, and I've been following remotely. So it's a privilege and it's an opportunity to be here on the other side of the camera. I wanted to thank the Queen's University, the Irish Studies seminars, the organizer, Peter Gray. It's great to be in a country where everything works. It doesn't take weeks to have an email and booking, so it doesn't seem so, but it's a great country. It's a great opportunity. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about the Enniskillen Horse, a paramilitary group that was established in the summer of 1912 in County Fermanagh, and which has been identified as one of the first paramilitary group organized in what is commonly referred to as the Irish Revolution. And following the title of this seminar, this case study on the Enniskillen Horse is part of my PhD research on the origins of paramilitarism in Ireland and the United Kingdom, where I have analyzed 4 case studies which work as a bridge between legality and illegality, between legitimacy and open insurrection against the British state, and the passage between volunteer organizations to paramilitary groups and terror drilling. Starting from the recognition that the larger and more famous Ulster and Irish volunteers had not just happened in a void, but were part of a developing process, my decision was to analyze these 4 groups, which were meant to understand the single steps between legality and illegality, to have the possibility to have a deeper knowing on these groups and their membership, to understand every step followed by these groups, which were acting within the limits of the law until they were not anymore. This helped me to better understand the origins of political violence in Ireland and the development of paramilitary groups. And together with the Enniskillen Horse, I have analyzed the young citizen volunteers from Belfast, the Fine Gael, and the Irish Citizen Army. This seminar is going to be structured around 4 major points. First of all, the sources, their locations, and their problems I had to deal with. Secondly, I will have a brief background on the events, particularly focusing on County Fermanagh and the protagonist of this story. Then we will retell the story of the Enniskillen Horse from within, presenting the chronological development and in the interaction with the local, national, and international actors until the Great War and the end of their paramilitary nature. The 4th section will look at the same developments, but from the perspective of the Irish and the British states, and it will see how the Enniskillen Horse were recognized, understood, and dealt with from its very first days of existence to its end. This will help us to understand the origins of the Irish Revolution and the role of both paramilitary groups and their reaction by the British state in accelerating its radicalisation and its militarisation. I will conclude with a brief discussion on what can be learned from this case study and on the broader topic of the Irish Revolution and on the debate on political violence. While researching on the Enniskillen Horse, I was shocked by the imbalance between the primary and secondary sources, because compared with other paramilitary groups and political movements that usually develop a huge amount of secondary sources, there is almost no study on the Enniskillen Horse, despite a large amount of primary sources, and it's an issue that we can debate later. Regarding the primary sources, there are 3 major collections that can be used in studying this group. The first, of course, it's here in Belfast at Cronin, specifically the County Fermanagh Ulster Volunteer Force papers, D 1402, and the Monterey family from County Tyrone, D 2023. These documents give us the details from within, thanks to an early draft of history of the movement and the several private letters from its leadership. The second collection is held in the Colonial Office in the National Archives in London, which is a collection that conserves the documents from the Irish government from Dublin Castle, transferred to London in 1922, and then it represents those documents that were saved and preserved after the destruction of the Four Corps during the Civil War. These are hundreds of thousands of pages that are available in Ireland and Northern Ireland only as microfilms, but in a few universities, such as Queen's University, they can be accessed online through Gale project. And I was able to have access to these documents only thanks to my visiting here in Belfast, so congratulations once more. And it's an extremely rich collection that usually is not read by scholars and students, so I encourage everybody to, as you have access to this collection online, to take a look, because it's the whole Dublin Castle collection online, which is amazing. And thirdly, the last, another important collection is, generally speaking, newspapers. As we will see later, the local press had an important role in the organization and evolution of the Enniskillen Horse. And in its internal debate, we can see more details about its evolution. And moreover, going back to the imbalance between primary and secondary studies and sources, I've done a study on the national and international press coverage on the Enniskillen Horse, and between 1912 and 1913, there were hundreds and hundreds of articles, both within the United Kingdom and moreover the British Empire and the Anglophone sphere, talking about the Enniskillen Horse. So I think it's also another important point of start. Secondary sources, despite the recent recognition by Timothy Bauman in his article on the role of the avant-garde of the Enniskillen Horse in the establishment of paramilitarism in Ireland, and his short comment on this group, secondary works on the Enniskillen Horse is almost non-existent. A first history of the group was presented in 1921, when the leader of the group published a 3-volume history of County Fermanagh. A century later, the recently published volume on the 2nd Battalion from Fermanagh has published a few pages and a few documents from regarding the Enniskillen Horse. And apart from these few publications, something can be found in the Enniskillen Museum in Enniskillen, and within the history of the North Irish Horse Regiment, which we will see later. But outside from the academia and the work of historians, the public memory of Enniskillen horses has not disappeared completely. I was able to find a couple of pictures from a Facebook group on the drumming club from County Fermanagh, which depicted the Enniskillen horse in one of the drum that was shown in 2021, 22, and 23. I have no updated information on this because the page has almost disappeared, but Facebook can be a source as well. So now let's move back to the background of this paper and County Fermanagh and its county town Enniskillen in the year 1912. So County Fermanagh is now on the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, and it's the door to the other island, to Ulster. It's a country heavily shaped by its geography, more than, I would say, almost more than its population. It's now borders with County Leitrim and County Cavan on the west side, and on the east side with counties Donegal, Tyrone, Monaghan, and Cavan, and it's divided by the River Erne, connecting the upper and lower lakes. And on this connection on the island, on the river connecting the two lakes, sits Enniskillen, the county. County Fermanagh is also, of course, heavily divided within its population, with a percentage between Catholics and Protestants remaining almost steady since the 1860s until the time of our paper, our discussion, with the Catholics having a slightly majority of 55 to 45%. However, this population had been decreasing and decreasing for decades since the Great Famine for decades. And particularly during the crisis of the late 19th century, we see the population going down and down, both in the county and in the city of Enniskillen, reaching a population of just above 60,000 people. So almost half, I mean, more than half the population it had about a century before, becoming the least populated county in Ulster. Having remained quite peaceful during the land war with such a small and divided population, however, with the 1884 Representation of the People Act, a new and modern clash started between the two factions. And after the first and the second general elections in 1885 and 1886, where the nationalist movement was able to obtain a seat in both North and South Fermanagh, having started the organization earlier. From the third election, 1892, a kind of balance and a status quo was established between the Unionist and the nationalist movements, with the Unionists taking the seat in the north of the county, and the nationalists taking a seat in the south, with most of these elections having no contestants. Local elections in the city of Enniskillen were strongly contested, and here the Unionist Party had gerrymandered the town in order to maintain a majority and win in 2 out of the 3 wards. However, just before the local 1914 elections, following a plan devised by the Catholic Archdeacon, a few nationalist electors rented a room in another part of the city in order to make them eligible in that division. And the Nationalist Party was able, thanks to this gerrymandering, to win the majority and take control of the town for the first time since the plantation. It was within this social and political background that the mind and the only organizer behind the Enniskillen Horse was born and educated, William Copeland Trimble, who came from an influential family which had developed and still maintained one of the strongest and longest relationship and ownership with the press. His father, William Trimble, was one of the founder of the Impartial Reporter in 1825, which make it the third oldest newspaper in Ireland after the Belfast Newsletter and the Derry Journal. Samuel Trimble, younger half-brother of William Copeland, was the founder of the Donegal Independent and later both the Armagh Guardian, which was later inherited by his son Charles. William Copeland Trimble was a peculiar character, risen in a Protestant family, which was much less impartial than his father. He had supported the small farmers movement, becoming the secretary of Fermanagh Tenant Right Association, but had left the movement in disagreement with the policy of the Irish Land League. During the first Home Rule movement, he became a unionist and started to use his paper as a vehicle of propaganda, fighting with the local nationalist paper, the Fermanagh Time, to become the strongest unionist paper in the country. Together with the local and unionist policy, William was much involved in the work of the historian, particularly focusing on the military history of Fermanagh and the 2 volunteer corps established during the Williamite Wars, the Enniskillen Dragoons and the Royal Enniskillen Fusiliers. Having heard of the establishment of the Mid-Ulster Army in January 1912, knowing that Edward Carson was about to visit County Fermanagh, William decided to put together his political and personal interest to present the Unionist leader with a surprise. While Carson and the Unionist Party were organizing the Ulster Tour during the summer recession of the House of Parliament, a tour through Ulster, which would have concluded in Belfast on 28th of September for the signature of the Ulster Covenant, Trimble started to organize a mounted escort which would have followed Carson during the day. With Enniskillen representing the first date of the Ulster Tour, expecting to see papers from across the world to report the event, Trimble wanted to give a display of strength, of smartness and masculinity of the Unionist movement. So he recruited a few dozens of men, nominated as sergeants the best men, usually those coming from the North Irish Horse, the yeomanry raised in the north of Ireland. And he organized a rehearsal which took place on September 10 in Enniskillen. He later described this moment of the paramilitary group with a connection with something that we can use to find a connection later with the Ulster Volunteer Force. And he said that no local military gentleman would undertake the command, highlighting how the movement had to become popular as the UVF later, before the unionist and the loyalist elite take a role within it. On the morning of Carson's visit to Enniskillen on the 18th of September, Trimble was at the command of 235 men, between officers, sergeants, and other civilians who participated. After a final rehearsal, they waited their guest at Kilheavling Bridge, which is now known anymore. Here, Carson arrived from Crom Castle, seat of the Earls of Erne, together with John Crichton, the 4th Earl of Erne and chairman of the event, with Lord Hugh Cecil, member of Parliament for Oxford University, and the Presbyterian Unionist Thomas Sinclair. The men entered the car, were escorted by 2 squadrons of men, each wearing a uniform composed by a dark coats and grey hats, the same grey worn by the Enniskillens in 1688. The rest of the day, it's not actually very important because it was one of those events during the tour. There were speeches, there were meetings. However, there was an interesting historical parallel presented by Carson himself, who recognized how Enniskillen, as Derry, had already been once the first defense of Ulster and Ireland against the Irish nationalist movement. The inaugural moment was followed by a moment of hiatus of thoughts caused by the farm operation, but the Enniskillen Horse maintained their organizations. About 40 of them took part in Ulster Day events at Enniskillen, meeting in uniform but unmounted, with Trimble to take part in the large mass held in St. Anne's Parish Church, now St. Martin's Cathedral, where the 3 Protestant churches in town gathered in support of the unionist policy. A few days later, a brief discussion in the House of Commons on the legality on the unionist escort to Edward Carson was rapidly ignored by Colonel Seeley, Secretary of State for War. And this gave Trimble the possibility to present his mounted corps to the press and highlight the loyalty of his men to the Crown and the Empire. Parallelly, step by step, the Enniskillen Horse kept organizing and drilling in County Fermanagh with new troops enlisting. With the auspices of establishing a Yeomanry Corps, Trimble organized a general meeting to be held on 26 December, when 2,020 out of the estimated 360 men took part in the day of drilling, dining, and celebration in Castle Cool and in the local Orange Hall. Here, letters of support were read coming from the King's private secretary, first contacted by Trimble to assure the Crown of their loyalty, from Lord Roberts, president of the National Service League, who was enthusiastic about the news related to the establishment and drilling of a truly patriotic cavalry volunteer regiment. And finally, a letter was received from the 6th Enniskillen Dragoons stationed in India, showing a strong support within the British Army. It was the intention of Trimble now to follow Roberts' policy and train his men and defend the country within a lawful and fully volunteer Yeomanry regiment, and this became something he often echoed, no further cost except that of the ammunition to the men. The first meeting on 1913 was held on 23rd of January, when 90 men, about 1/4 of the total strength, paraded. And while the men later were engaged in the farm working, Trimble kept establishing relationships with local and distant friends who started to send money. Parallelly, however, within the private rooms of the Orange Order, Trimble was openly discussing the need for every unionist man to arm himself and get ready to defend the country against home rule. Following this, when the Enniskillen Horse met again on the 24th of March, Easter Monday, the 150 men were now armed with swords and lances and bandoliers, but no rifles. Once again, while his men were working in the fields, Trimble was working for them, and when the regiment met again on the 13th of June, a few days after the second reading in the House of Commons of the Home Rule Bill, now the 170 men were armed with swords, lances, bandoliers, and a few rifles. It's interesting to see that through a personal conversation, it seemed that Trimble had managed to get about 70 rifles, but as only a few of his men had been able to get a gun license, he wanted to remain within the limits of the law, and he had not been able to distribute the other rifles to his men. The following meeting in October 1913, with about 200 men participating, represented the beginning of a new political use of the Enniskillen Horse by Trimble, because now several delegations coming from England and Scotland came to see County Fermanagh and the rest of Ireland to see the situation of the country before the final vote on the Home Rule, and Trimble lost no opportunity to show the Unionist perspective on the issue and the readiness of the men from Ulster to arm themselves and defend their country. The popularity of the corps was shown in the second annual reunion on Boxing Day. It was if the previous year the Enniskillen Horse were standing alone against the Home Rule, now their allies were growing and growing, and at the dinner there were present E.M. Archdale, chairman of the executive committee of the Ulster Unionist Council, and C.F. Pauls, commander of one of the battalion of the UVF Fermanagh. Now, County Fermanagh had also 5,000 members in the infantry paramilitary group, showing both the strength of the Unionist movement, but also the role of privilege and the evidence of smartness, ability, and status of the member of the Enniskillen Horse. The first month of 1914 saw the Enniskillen Horse, together with the rest of the Unionist movement and paramilitary forces, move towards the upcoming clash. On 20 March, the day of the Coorak incident, the men were informed by the leadership of the UVF to prepare to mobilize and await orders. Nothing happened. During the Easter holidays, however, the entire Unionist movement of County Fermanagh mobilized, with about 2,000 civilians taking part in the demonstration. The final event before this upcoming civil war, which they were drilling for, was the regimental camp held at Castlehume, led by the 5th Marquess of Ely in early June, just before the upcoming third reading of the Home Rule Bill. Having organized as a private and political yeomanry group with seasonal drilling, Trimble had also been able to establish a network of support, which saw financial support coming from both the diaspora, with donation coming from Canada and the US, but also from the army, with several donations he kept private, coming from a cavalry regiment in India, possibly the battalion from the Enniskillen Horse. Every supporter of the movement joined the camp, with George Richardson, General Commander of UVF, Colonel Wood Martin, who was nominated Honorary Commander Colonel of the Corps, and even a delegation coming from London, where Dr. Bailey had established a troop of 20 horsemen in support of the UVF. On Friday, 12th of June, for Richardson's general inspection, 200 men of the Enniskillen Horse and 1,000 men of the 3rd Fermanagh UVF Battalion were encouraged to get ready, and a sham fight against forces invading Fermanagh from County Donegal and from the south showed the concern of a Protestant community feeling surrounded by enemies. With the end of the camp, the civilians returned to their homes, while those who were members of the North Irish Horse moved to Newcastle, County Down, for their regular drilling camp from their yeomanry regiment, helping confusing even more the difference between the private organization and the legitimate military corps. Just when the Unionist movement was ready to openly fight the forces of the upcoming Irish state, the Great War began, and the military leadership of the Enniskillen Horse and the Ulster Volunteer Force was forced to leave and return to their position in the army, leaving the rest of the force in great confusion. Similarly to the events of the Ulster Volunteer Force, after an initial confusion, the Enniskillen Horse decided to offer its service to the Home Service. However, they were refused because the War Office was now raising the new army. And while the former members of the Enniskillen Horse within the British Army were dying in Europe, it was eventually decided to enlist the Enniskillen Horse as a volunteer cavalry regiment within the Unionist division. If the Fermanagh men had been able to present a force of about 300 men in the previous months, due to the call for arms and the debarment by age, only 26 men joined the new squadron during its first week, and it took 5 weeks for the divisional cavalry squadron to reach the full war strength of 160 men enlisted. Trimble was lost in this moment because he was 64 of age, too old to participate in the war, and also he lacked any military experience, despite as he tried to present himself being an expert of military history. He was later issued a Silver War badge after several letters sent to Carson. Having sailed to France in October 1915 with the 36th Ulster Division, the men who had participated in the Enniskillen Horse became part of the 2nd North Irish Horse Regiment in June 1916, and the following year, due to the modernity of the warfare, they were dismounted and were absorbed into the 9th Battalion of the Royal Irish Fusiliers. Quite surprisingly, as I stated in the introduction of this paper, there is a lack of studies of Enniskillen Horse because following the Great War, almost every memory of this movement was removed. Trimble published a 3-volume book on the history of County Fermanagh, where he described the history of this movement. Some articles were later published in the 50s for the 25th, in the 50s and in the anniversaries of the establishment of the group. But later, the Enniskillen Horse sharply fell into oblivion, which huge shock compared with the work of propaganda made and attempted by its leader. This, however, is just one perspective on the history of the Enniskillen Horse, and it's produced by the primary sources they have left. It's interesting, I think, to now move to the Irish and the British government and see how they recognized, understood, and dealt with it. This will enable us to understand the structure of the Irish government and its failure to react to the radicalisation and the militarisation of the Irish volunteers. The organization of the Enniskillen Horse did not happen within a completely peaceful and unarmed country. Following the incitement by Captain Craig in the years before, few Orangemen had already started to drill in County Fermanagh. This was reported by the nationalist newspaper Anglo-Celt as an incredible sensation and the dawn of a new politics in County Fermanagh, with unlicensed men escaping as soon as a policeman had come to understand the situation. However, when the local constabulary was informed his superiors that the initiative has been started by the rector of the local Protestant church, and this was just a shooting match for prizes, followed by a tea party, and a stop after a few meetings because the participants had got tired of such a monotonous business, it seemed that nothing was happening anymore in County Fermanagh. In the months before Edward Carson's visit to Enniskillen, however, more and more small groups of men started to drill. With such a small population and thanks to the capillarity of the Royal Irish Constabulary, everything was noted and transmitted to Dublin. These months, however, started to prove the difficulty by the Irish police forces in understanding and reacting to the events. On one side, there was the difficulty in communicating and transmitting the information with the long chain of command, which could take weeks to have information transmitted from a local village to Dublin Castle and back. And secondly, there was also the different level of alert within the chain of command. Usually the local constabularies failed to transmit the information to the head constabularies or the deputy inspectors, as the events did not differentiate from those which had taken place during the first and the second Home Rule crisis, where men drill with no real actual consequences. When their superiors, their county inspectors, deputy inspector general, pushed for more information after being alerted by the local press, it was difficult to have a more clear understanding of the events with incomplete reports and the lack of direct testimonies. Compared with the UVF, the actions by Trimble and his Enniskillen Horse were better reported by the police due to the necessity of drilling in the open fields, while most of the Orangemen and Unionists used to drill in private homes in the Orange Halls. The Enniskillen Horse could now be openly observed drilling and marching on the public roads. Even the events of Carson's visit, with the showing of his mounted escort, was reported by the local police, however, without real interest, and on the contrary, in the following weeks, it was reported how the county had returned to a state of quiet, despite the organizations of the Manchester's Smarties anniversary. When, however, the Enniskillen Horse returned after their inauguration, these events started to worry Undersecretary for Ireland James Brown Doherty, who asked advice from Attorney General Ignatius O'Brien and the Lord Chancellor of Ireland, Redmond Barry, who both recognized that Trimble's role as a justice of peace made not desirable to take action and risk to increase his popularity and support. Adding to this, the fact that the corps was still unarmed and not officially connected with any political group or secret societies, and had received no support from prominent men within the Unionist movement or the Orange Lodges, encouraged the police not to deal with it. The Irish judicial power was interrogated a few months later by the War Office, when Trimble had gotten in contact with it to try to receive second-hand lances and free ammunition. Once again, the Attorney General Ignatius O'Brien, supported by the Undersecretary, highlighted how any official recognition of the Enniskillen Horse would have increased the difficulty in dealing with a corps which was developing on the borderline of illegality. At the parade of the 13th June 1913, when the Enniskillen Horse first marched with rifles, the police was on the place to observe and take notes of each participant and how they were armed. Informed of these events, Doherty asked once again advice from the Attorney General, now in the person of John Moriarty, who compared with his predecessors, was firm in describing these events as absolutely illegal, and Trimble as guilty of felony according to 1848 Treasony Felony Act. However, once again, when finally the police and judicial system had started to react to the radicalisation of the Unionist movement, any reaction was prevented by the Chief Secretary, Augustine Birrell. Not only the Enniskillen Horse was left organizing, drilling, and arming themselves, and even taking part in the summer camp of 1914 to get ready to fight against the forces of the Irish state, but nothing was done to prevent or to stop it. The officers who were sent to observe the camp were even prevented to attend the events by armed men to show once more how, if only the Great War had not drastically changed the course of the events, the Irish government had no plans in how to deal with the menace of an Irish civil war started by the Unionist movement. This has usually been explained by the failure in understanding the willingness by the Unionist movement to violently act, calling it a bluff, and expecting the crisis to be averted at the last moment, such as had happened during the First and the Second Home Rule. Surely the fact that this radicalisation had started within the Unionist movement while the Irish government had established its antibodies against the nationalist movement could be one of the causes. However, the weakness of the Irish state should be better analysed. Starting, for example, from the police forces and the Royal Irish Constabulary, which depended on its long chain of command to maintain Dublin and the periphery in constant contact, while the local constabularies worked on the field and knew every person in the county and could rely on informants within almost every group. It was the county inspector who worked as intermediator with Dublin Castle, and his understanding of the situation affected the communication between the two poles. County Fermanagh had seen John Alexander Maguire, born in 1854, leaving his position together with other two district inspectors in February 1913 after 15 years of service as a county inspector. He was momentarily substituted by John Fitzgerald Gelstone, who had been recently promoted to county inspector of County Cavan. In May, however, he was moved at his request to County Clare, with a game of seats forcing the local county inspectors to move to Donegal and Harry B. Morrell from Donegal to Fermanagh. Unsatisfied with this position, and after having been substituted for 4 months by a third-class deputy inspector, Morrell asked to be moved to County Carlow, trading place with John Hughes, who remained in such a position until early 1917 and was followed by 3 more county inspectors before the establishment of the Irish Free State and of the Royal Ulster Constabulary. With such a constant mobility, with the unwillingness of any officers to take its seat in County Fermanagh, without knowing on which side of the border it would have found itself, and facing a growing aggressive political movement, Dublin Castle lost its most reliable sources of information and was unable to effectively understand the developments taking place in County Fermanagh. This was worsened by the private opinion on the Unionist movement, with Neville Chamberlain, Inspector General from 19 to August 1916, who was considered as a true blue unionist and underestimated the danger posed by the unionist paramilitary movement, and Augustin Birrell, Chief Secretary from 1907, who on one side was suffering from a private mourning with his wife suffering of brain tumor from 1911 until her death in March 1915, and on the other, his hope that the Home Rule crisis could have passed without his intervention. The same judiciary power was passing through an unstable moment caused by the rapid succession of appointed, with the three central officials, the Lord Chancellor, the Attorney General, and the Solicitor General, passing from hand to hand without giving the possibility to effectively influence the policy of the Irish government, which we can clearly see from this graph, which the appointed moving faster and faster. One last actor who could have prevented the escalation of the Irish Revolution can be found in the British Army. Here as well, however, the events concerning the Enniskillen Horse showed how the system was unprepared to deal with an insurrection of such a magnitude and a strong social support from the Unionist population and the Conservative Party. The attitude of the army regarding the Enniskillen Horse and the Unionist movement was, of course, of various nature. While many soldiers, officers, and volunteers openly supported the Unionist movement, drilled the men, and sent money, others openly disapproved of their actions and called the whole movement as illegal. After the initial involvement in the parliamentary discussion concerning the legitimacy of Carson's military escort, the War Office strongly reacted when Viscount Crichton inspected the Enniskillen Horse in October 1913. When Secretary of State of War called upon him to resign his majority in the Royal Horse Guards, he found himself facing a situation that a few months later would have escalated in the Curragh incident. When several officers in Crichton's regiment resolved to resign in protest of their commander's punishment, Seeley was forced to personally write a letter withdrawing the call for Crichton's resignation, requesting him to remain with his regiment. While the War Office was left unable even to censor the political position taken by some of its men to prevent a larger politicization of the army, Trimble openly discussed the support received by generals within the British Army and other commanding officers who had promised him to ignore any orders to fight the Unionist movement. Based on the case study of the Enniskillen Horse, several broader conclusions can be drawn about the nature of the British and Irish states during the Home Rule crisis and the origin of the Irish Revolution. First of all, that to really understand the Irish Revolution, it is necessary to study the role of the actors against which the revolution was started and fought, meaning the Irish and the British states, and not just the parties and the government. Secondly, to recognize that the Irish government was weak and structurally unable to comprehend or respond to political radicalisation, especially when it originated from the Unionist movement. The administrative apparatus in Dublin Castle suffered from chronic instability, and its bureaucratic inertia was compounded by personal sympathies and undervaluation. As a result, even when the Enniskillen Horse openly drilled, armed itself, and prepared for insurrection, the state hesitated to intervene, viewing the movement as a bluff or a temporary agitation. Thirdly, the British government in London underestimated the escalation which had taken place following the first and the second Home Rule, and it seemed that the script for the crisis was already written. Many in Westminster saw Ulster's paramilitary mobilisation as a political tool rather than a prelude to a civil war, and crucially, significant elements within the British state, especially the army and section of the Conservative Party, actively sympathized with the Unionist cause. This support blurred the lines between state authority and partisan rebellion, as seen when army officers supplied weapons, offered tacit or support, or even threatened resignation rather than enforce orders against the Unionists. Ireland had in effect become a political battleground where Unionist resistance was instrumentalized to weaken the liberal government. Finally, the militarization of the British society had eroded the boundaries between official forces and civilian volunteers. The proliferation of youth organizations like the Boys Brigade and Boy Scout, alongside campaigns for compulsory military service, had normalized paramilitary training and patriotic mobilization. The Enniskillen Horse exemplified this trend. It emerged not as a clandestine conspiracy, but as a publicly celebrated, sponsored by the media, movement that drew on military tradition, imperial loyalty, and cross-class support. This cultural shift made it difficult for the state to distinguish between legitimate volunteering and seditious organizing. In summary, the Enniskillen Horse was not an isolated phenomenon, but a symptom of deeper structural failures. The Irish administration was ill-equipped to confront armed unionism, the British government was divided and complacent, and broader social militarization had legitimized extra-legal paramilitary activity. Together, these factors accelerated the radicalisation and militarization of the Irish politics, paving the way for the revolutionary period that followed. I hope this paper has helped both in rediscovering the history of one of the first paramilitary groups of the Irish Revolution, but also in improving our understanding of the militarization and radicalization of the early moments of the Irish Revolution and the passage between legality and illegality. And finally, I leave here a brief bibliography which can be used for those who are interested. I want to thank you once again, and I'm now open for questions, comments, etc. Thank you so much.
Lucas, thank you so much. That's a really excellent paper. I'm sure we will have questions from the room. People online want to ask a question, raise your hand electronically. I bet we'll pick that up or type a question into the text box. So let's open it up to the floor. Who'd like to start? I'd like to start. Yes.
Thanks very much for that. You were saying earlier on that part of Trimble's, I suppose, motive for forming Enniskillen Horse was actually to demonstrate communist masculinity in a kind of proper form. I mean, famously on the other side of things, Pearse actually does theorize masculinity in quite a coherent, explicit way. Is there a similar kind of, well, I suppose, theorization or description of the forms of masculinity?
Should I collect those? Well, yeah, I mean, one of the starting point of my research was actually try to see the connections between the unionist and nationalist culture and movements. And of course, when we're talking about Pearse, we're talking about this, the strength of the origins of the ancient generations of our ancestors. And I mean, one chapter of my thesis was on the Finneran, which takes so much from the propaganda, from the study, from the school of Pearse. But Pearse was living in the United Kingdom, so meaning that that was a larger topic, a larger discussion, which was taking place actually all across Europe since the late 19th century. And the concept of masculinity, this Christian masculinity, is very common both in Ireland, UK, but also in Europe. And I think it's almost like they are coming to the same conclusion, starting from very opposite starting point. But it's a moment of virilization of the culture. I mean, the modern Olympics are established in those decades to prove the masculinity, the strength of a country. In the sport, this is just propaganda. They're just showing, they're not really doing anything. But it is to show the health of a country, of its inhabitants, of its people. So it's coming from the same causes and the same origins behind the establishment of the Boy Scout, which we went with the Second Boer War, showing the weakness of the population due to economic crisis, of poor people not being able to serve in the army. And so now it's a movement of rebirth, of re-establishment, of going back to the education, to the government, to the state, to the political parties and movements, to have a real role within the private life of the people. So starting from the youth to the workers, both in the farm and the industry in the city, to take a more active role for the benefit of the state. So.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about the role of the horse in this.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, it is a particular point in history, and it's not until the Purple War starts that it becomes clear that the horse's future in the battlefield is strictly limited. Well, I mean, there's at least two implications there. I mean, one is, if you're talking about mounted force, does that mean you're drawing your people from somewhat higher surface class down the rest, down the UBM? And secondly, how much of this is for show? Because how easy is it to turn a mounted civilian into a mounted warrior? I mean, there's a lot of specialized training of the person and the horse.
Yeah, that's
to make a mounted force effective.
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's a horse, it's a human thing, it's alive. It's not just cars or motorbikes. So yeah, the role of propaganda is huge. I mean, Trimble is a propaganda guy. It's showing, and everything starts as a rehearsal. We are going to do the same thing that happened in 1688 when the people of Enniskillen established a horse cavalry regiment, a volunteer corps to defend the city. So everything starts from that. And it's interesting to see the effectiveness, but also the role of the horses, because from one side there is Trimble, the unionist movement, defending the horse itself, saying these are huge, powerful horse that our farmers are not selling to France, to Belgium, in a time when a horse is hundreds of pounds, and they are keeping that for themselves, for the unionist movement. On the other side, there is the nationalist press and the nationalist propaganda, who is mocking the Enniskillen horse, saying they are not horses, they are donkey, actually. They are horses meant for farm work. I'm not an expert of horse. What I can do is taking a look at the pictures, maybe, and see the health of these animals, which I'm not an expert. It would be difficult to say if these were actually war horses. Of course, the Great War showed an effective role that a cavalry regiment could have had in a moment of fight. Of course, the Irish Civil War that never happened would have never been a battle. So cavalry regiment used as work behind and guerrilla can be kind of difficult to see. It could have been probably used as a intelligence and move information rapidly. And the question of the social class, it's huge. And I wanted to I made a study trying to map the members of Enniskillen Horse in the County Fermanagh to see if they were coming from the richer or the poorer part of the society. I have a couple of lists of memberships produced both by Trimble and the police, and the members tended to come from, of course, farmers families. Usually they are the son, the first or the older or the second son of the farmer. Usually they are kind of young, as in the Ulster and other paramilitary groups. And there are a couple of members coming from Enniskillen having a higher social class. But as we find in other paramilitary groups, I'm thinking about the Irish Citizen Army with Countess Markievicz participating and rising, of course, the level of the membership. Usually there are farmers, son of farmers, which tends to be richer than workers from rural workers. So they own the land usually, and they could put a horse, not in the field, but to the Ulster volunteers. So it's something in between that. I'm still trying, and this social study of the membership is still going on. I'm trying to explore that direction. But of course, the participation in the Enniskillen Horse made you better compared to your neighbor who participated in the Ulster volunteer as an infantry. Thank you.
Yes.
Trimble was a Presbyterian, but the county is Protestant population was largely Church of Ireland or Methodist rather than Presbyterian. Is there any evidence that this was a source of tension between Trimble and others in the area involved in the Enniskillen Horse?
I come from a Catholic country where 100% of the people are Catholic. I'm not Catholic anymore. So the question of religion is always very difficult for me, particularly here in the north of Ireland, in Northern Ireland. I know that County Fermanagh had a percentage within the Protestant population different from the rest of Ulster. In the early 20th century, I find no tensions between the different movements, something, and I don't have the percentage right now of the membership. I have the religion affiliation because I was able to cross-reference this list with the census, and it tends to be or tend to represent the same balance of the Protestant population in County Fermanagh. And the participation of the movement in the anti-home rule movement in County Fermanagh, it was a moment of cooperation between the three churches, of the three main Protestant churches. So I didn't find any tensions between. I found a tension between the Ulster Volunteer Force and the Enniskillen Horse, and initially with the Unionist movement and the Orange Order, whose leadership are not going to these events, are not participating in the first person in the early moments of the developments. But with the religion, I've seen Trimble participating in religious events, talking with the local priests from different churches. So I wouldn't say his religious affiliation made it any significant problem.
Yes. Picking up on the point earlier about the social force, is there any information about whether the Irish volunteers on the other side of the fight tried to raise or had any sort of cavalry?
So something interesting about County Fermanagh is that after the Great War, and particularly later in the 20th century, the clash between the Unionists and the Nationalists was huge. But the Irish volunteers were very, very late in establishing a corps in County Fermanagh. It happened months and months later compared to Dublin, and then rapidly exploded, and they surpassed the number of members in the Ulster Volunteers, in the local Ulster Volunteers. The Enniskillen Horse was established in the early moments of the Home Rule crisis, and it was actually not the only cavalry regiment within the Ulster Volunteer Force. There was the Ballymena Horse, which was the second largest, which is even less studied. But the Enniskillen Horse was the only one who was able to establish itself after an initial moment of propaganda, build a hierarchy, having officers, having meetings for months and almost years. The other cavalry regiments within the Unionist movements tended to have more propaganda and publicity role, tended to have less members. The Irish volunteers did not, to my any knowledge, try to build an opponent cavalry corps, probably also because of the different social classes from the nationalist and unionist population in County Fermanagh. One of the connection I made is that, of course, it always go back to that, the nationalist population was strongest in the rural and poorer areas of the county. And if I can go back to the map. So the nationalist population is strongest here on the western side of County Fermanagh, which is full of small mountains and hills. So they are very spread around the county. So it's also difficult. It would also have been difficult for them to find a place to gather, not having any fields on there or huge castle that could host a cavalry corps, probably. Perfect.
Thanks, Luca. I'm just wondering how prominent was the discussion of the possibility of partition, and to what extent did that kind of drive some of this mobilisation on both sides.
It's there. It's County Fermanagh within the unionist movement, with Carson's point of view on what you do with the home rule. It's a huge topic. I mean, until it was in the Northern Ireland, it was still debated. Of course, there is a huge movement in County Tyrone, in County Fermanagh, in Londonderry, to push the Irish Ulster movement to take all Ulster within the new upcoming state. So there is not a discussion whether we should divide the county or leave. They are huge in demanding the whole Ulster, the whole unionist population, to be part of this. Unfortunately, my research on the Enniskillen Horse, due to their participation in the Great War, ends in 1914. What I'm going to explore in the next years probably is to see the participation of the members later in the local and the national politics, to see the direction of the movement. But from what I see, they were strongly in disagreement with any possible detachment of partial of the entire county to whatever Ulster would have become.
I'm sorry. I'm not sure I quite understood the bit where you're saying they participated in the First World War. Did they do that by like sort of all signing up, or were they sort of integrated into the British Armed Forces as their own regiments? Like, did they maintain their existing power structure?
So no, the easy answer is no, because of their membership, which was strongly composed by soldiers who were called by the British Army and had to leave the Enniskillen Horse. And also because of age, because a large part of this membership was too old to participate as a volunteer in the army. They were unable. Some of them were unable to leave their house and their works in the fields. So the problem with the Enniskillen Horse, and also it can be easily understood by the letters from Trimble, who's annoyed. He's publishing in his paper daily, weekly and weekly papers, articles inviting the former members of the Enniskillen Horse and other participants of the Ulster Volunteer Force to join the corps, which is enlisting for the new army. But enough people take part in this volunteering movement, but the identity of the Enniskillen Horse is lost on the first day of this movement. So they join the 36th Ulster Division, of course, but it's also difficult to find sources from the paper. So, for example, I'm thinking about here Belfast and the Young Citizen Volunteers, which are able to build a battalion because they are enough. And so during the war, their battalion is still referred to as the Young Citizen Volunteers Battalion instead of the 14 or whatever. And later, going back to the role of cavalry during the Great War, they are moved away from the first line. They are dismounted and they are not horse anymore. No. I think there was a debate on this. I think it's part of Carson saying we are not rebuilding the Ulster Volunteers after the Great War. And it's actually, I mean, it was shocking for me to go back to the primary sources, to the newspapers, not to find any connections to any referral to the Enniskillen Horse after the Great War, apart from the obituary of some officers of anniversary talking, oh yeah, we did this. Also going back to the idea of propaganda, because Trimble saw that as a failure. But it's something interesting about, and then I'm going to the next question. It's about the problem of Trimble's papers, which are not found yet by me or who has studied this. Some papers of the Trimble family are kept at Prony, but until the 80s. I've been in contact with the impartial reporter, which are not very open to the idea of look what they have, also because these are private papers, and maybe they just don't want me to, or any scholars to read that. So anything that happened later, still work in progress. Sorry.
Basically, you found that paradoxically, particularly not charming from politics point of view, because these the facts, all these kind of arguments and join IRA, I'm not IRA, I explain myself better. The volunteers or the Irish volunteers and the national volunteers, they split, the majority. Raymond, the home incitate, push the volunteers to join the majority. And O'Neill, the leader of the volunteers, push as well. And the majority went to fight with the national volunteers, went to fight with the British Army because they thought that there will be, after any kind of treaty, the British would give us freedom. And on the other side, instead, they went to fight because they want to retain the Union. But in this thing with the Union, again, you don't find intrigue and why they contradicted as well. The idea of Carson that was completely different from the idea of all the rest of the government, like Sinclair, Craig, Asquith, Lloyd George, that were happy enough to keep only a few counties where there were the majority population come from. At the time for the plantation, they were established there, and Carson instead that could and love, but he did say that Bullard instead, I don't know if England was the starting, the leading star economically. Without England, we would be lost.
The Carson's character is always intriguing. I mean, the more I study him, the more fascinating I find him. I mean, I understand how he could become a leader for such a huge and powerful movement. Carson was a lawyer, I think. This is the starting point of this reflection. So he knew how to win a case. And I think like he knew what to get and how to get it. And I mean, he probably spent a couple of years presenting his case to see the direction of the judge, meaning the judge, the population, the army, the British government, but already knowing I can ask for 100 and I will be happy with 60, and the British government is offering 65. It's enough, it's great. And there's the huge debate on was partition the only possible solution for this. There's a couple of volumes debating on this, and it seems that everybody is just trying to find. They are spending the from 1911 to 1925 a solution, a different solution from the Unionists, from the Nationalists, from the British side, and as soon as the third home rule is presented, it seems that everybody knows it's going to end with partition. And they have a long journey trying to avoid, and then they go back. This is the only solution. I mean, from an Italian perspective, coming from the first time, taking a look at the third home rule crisis, it's shocking. It's shocking for me the absence of the real Irish Civil War. So a real fight, a real battle between the Unionists and the Nationalists, which is not happening in 1914 because of the Great War, but it's also not really happening in 1918, where the Unionists are happy with the status quo, taking these 6 counties, and the Nationalists are fighting, but the British and then the Irish Free State government instead of the Protestant population. So the two volunteer corps are fights, but together in the Battle of the Somme during the Great War, but not fighting against each other as they were established and built and drilled for.
maybe, sorry, the fact that being the so-called the trans war, the Irish war, is not due to the fact that the war went too long.
The war meaning the Great War, or
understand the British war and the British at the beginning they say, probably not in innocent, maybe they were convinced that the war would have been finished before, and because the war would be so short,
okay,
that also one of the reasons why the majority of the warriors joined the Irish war.
yeah, I'm in a disagreement.
The national war.
Yeah,
And when they become disillusioned, they see that the war was taking long,
yeah,
and there was in the 1916 right after persecution, they come back and they join the IRA, be volunteers, whatever you want to call it. I think that the IRA, with this kind of name, born in 1816 Canada during an assault at the border between the General Mahoney, the family, and the two one of the places to attack Canada for the first time. See that the was anyway. Come back to the point. Probably was also that one the reason why the soldiers were then once they came back. They joined the
I'm not an expert on the Irish participation in the Great War, but I have a strong position on this, and I'm in disagreement with most of the academy, saying that they meaning everybody knew that the Great War was expected to take a longer period than we're going back to for Christmas, because like going back to the sources, the British Army, the press, the political movements, they were aware of the modernity of the war. They knew the war was coming, was the new modern war, and would have taken a huge toll, both economically, of lives and also time. So I think maybe now we are too much reading on the propaganda of the time, and we are starting to think that they thought the Great War would have been solved in a few months. But they were aware, and they had to hide this so that the population could participate and volunteer, go to France or whatever to die. But I think it was a huge movement of convincing the people to join. Yeah, please.
We're just talking a lot about the extent of the participation of these volunteers in signing up to the Great War. And you mentioned like age being a limiting factor for a lot of them. On the other side, some of them had military backgrounds before they joined the Enniskillen Horse, like I don't know, like Boer War veterans.
So a large section, probably 20% of the large. I mean, because it's also a problem of understanding the membership of the Enniskillen Horse, because like it's rise and rise. So we are talking about at the peak 350 members, but there are about 400-500 people participating in the Enniskillen Horse during the history of the movement, because sometimes I go, sometimes my brother go in my stead with my horse, because maybe it's almost the family participating in the movement. So it's difficult to understand how many people are actually participating. They are never all together, despite the fact that they signed the document, they signed the list. And so Trimble can go on his paper saying we have 400 members, and then he's not even able to gather a third of his own members. And so about this membership, I would say 20-25% of those who participate in one or other moments of the history of the corps are former soldiers, or are actively participating in volunteer corps as the yeomanry. So particularly the officers are coming from a military background. It's Trimble, the only guy who has not really any military background apart from his fascination with history. So it's almost like a corps which is guided and led by a man who is really believing in the movement and has no real experience apart from what he's read. And then there are this class of officers who are real officers in the real army, who makes all the real work. And then there is this huge number of members who participate and then leaves. There's also a huge level, of course, of emigration in County Fermanagh. So I expect a lot of these people not participating in the summer and then the fall and the next spring meeting because they have just left. So it was a very rapid movement of people. So that's also probably why they failed to join as a group. To going back to the question we have done before, they failed to join as a group because it's very volatile, it's very liquid.
Yeah.
So my question is about, you said that there was support from the diaspora, that he gained money from like Canada and America and elsewhere. I suppose the question is well, two parts. How did they find out about the Enniskillen Horse? And then if it was through Trimble, how was he working out who would be sympathetic, who would be supportive of that? So if he was targeting people specifically, was he targeting people who he knew that then had left? If that makes sense, if there was any way to
So I did this study on the press, and it's fascinating to see how much they were talking about this corps when today nobody's talking about this, because it was shocking for the audience. And as I said, it was the beginning of the Ulster tour. Everybody was there to take a look, and all the city was there and all the county. So there were people from the local press transmitting the information to Ireland and England, and then these papers were then republished in papers in the Northern America, but also there were a couple of articles from the Army Gazette talking about this, which had a global audience, and then of course there's the personal connection with people keeping in touch with County Fermanagh, with their parents. And as we have seen, the population going down means that people, hundreds and thousands of people are leaving and have left County Fermanagh and have been in contact with the parents, with the relatives in the county. And probably that's the two ways they are informed about this. And probably they just send money to Trimble because it's a paper, so they have the address and they say, take this money for the Enniskillen Horse, as they later did with the Ulster Volunteer Force. If this is, it was your question, yeah.
Yes, anything online then?
Yes,
Yeah.
no prescription to
No, for the army. No. They,
this rule apply also to the rest of the United Kingdom.
you mean to the British Army? Interesting question. So there was no compulsory service in the UK until very late in the Great War, which is fascinating and is incredible compared with other countries, because the United Kingdom had no compulsory service until the Great War, and compared with countries such as Germany, which had a 3 years long conscription, as in Italy, as in France, because it was a country of freedom and democracy. And so our soldiers are voluntarily participating in the army, and the strength of the empire is in this volunteering participation, voluntary going back to economic needs, maybe. When in 1916 there was the compulsory service in the United Kingdom, it was only for England, Scotland, and Wales. Later, it was a law was written to apply conscription, mandatory conscription for Ireland too. There was a huge protest. There was a huge strike organized by the Irish Labour Party, and it was something that would have probably caused more damages than benefits. Also because the Irish actually participated in huge numbers to the volunteer new British New Army. They tended to come, of course, from the north of the country, from unionist background. So I think, if I remember correctly, Ulster sent 50% of the volunteers, and Belfast by itself sent 1 out of 4 men who volunteer in the Great War. So there was no need, because those who wanted, meaning those loyal to the kingdom, to the empire, enlisted, and those who didn't want to enlist would have probably caused more damages, because as we've seen later.
So is there anyone who wants to ask a question who hasn't had the chance yet? No, in that case, oh yeah, at the back.
You said earlier about, it's like a bit of a clarification on one of the questions about the social classes of the members. You said about the show of strength, like it wasn't just to show the numbers of support, but also you said that forces in that time could have been sold for hundreds of pounds to France and Belgium. Was it also to show the economic strength of the unionist movement, to say that we can give these forces to like a paramilitary regiment instead of having to have them on the fields?
Yeah, definitely. It's something Trimble goes back once more and more in his articles. It's the strengths of the men participating, but also like the economical strengths behind the unionist volunteers, and also it's how much they can put into this, because they believe so much. They are putting everything they have. It's difficult to have any comparisons with today's, but it's like I'm putting my card service of the party, which is, it's important for me because it's important for my job, but also because I spend so much and I'm spending so much, and also it's being farmers. Of course, I imagine they also had like they raise horses, and they put all their economic interest into the movement. So it's interesting because, like, yeah, Ireland was at the time, I'm not an expert on that as well, selling hundreds and thousands of horses, both to the British Army, but also to foreign countries, because it was a very rich economy. And Trimble goes back to the propaganda idea that, no, our men are keeping this liability for the movement instead of just taking the opportunity and sell the horses. Also because Europe is expecting the war, so they are buying horses. And that goes back to the idea that maybe these were presented as war horses, because if France and Belgium could buy it for their armies, maybe they could have been used also by the British Army in the Great War.
Okay, great. We'll make that the last question. Thank you very much to everyone who's participated, and especially to Luca, who's come all the way from Naples to present on his research at a time when he's preparing to defend his dissertation. It is important research. It's great to have that you've been able to come here and present this to an audience here in the north of Ireland. The questions have been widespread and engaged. So can we thank Luca for coming and sharing with us today? Just before we finish, we do have a seminar next Monday. We've got Katrina Kennedy coming from York to speak about women in the public sphere in revolutionary Ireland, by which she means the 1780s and 1790s, that earlier phase of revolution in Irish history. So please come and join us 4:30 in this room next Monday.